Welcome everyone today to TEPoP, the TEPoP online event, which has the theme Filling Gaps in Existing Recording and Data. I am Nikki Duplessis and I work at JNCC as a Natural Capital Evidence Specialist in the Ecosystems Analysis team. So just to let you know that we will be recording this talk today and we'll be uploading it to YouTube. So please keep your cameras and microphones off while the presentations are taking place. Right, so this is the fourth of our online TEPoP events this autumn. You can see the full program here. Events 1 to 4 have or are being recorded and added to the JNCC YouTube channel. So if you want to catch up with anything you can't make, then this will be possible for most events. And if you have any questions or for further information, do drop us an email at our TEPoP email address, which is in the bottom right-hand corner. So UK TEPoP was created to bring together a key set of partners, which you can see on the left, working in the field of terrestrial biodiversity surveillance and monitoring. It's intended to be a mechanism to share guidance and facilitate communication across the terrestrial surveillance and monitoring that is funded or co-funded by JNCC. So we as JNCC host these annual meetings to exchange ideas and ways of working with the aim of informing the work planning of each member of the UK TEPoP. We welcome you all and any other organizations joining our discussion today. So as you can see in the slide, both structured and unstructured biological data across the UK are extremely valuable for our understanding of biodiversity and how it's changing. The slide tries to capture the different ways that TEPoP data has been and continues to be used due to various beneficial attributes such as repeat annual sampling and long-term data sets. There's a lot of information on the slide, as you can see, which I think is testament to the multiple benefits that TEPoP data brings to both science, to people, and to policy. So just to pick out a few highlights, TEPoP has a network of over 18,000, make that, volunteers involved in biodiversity recording. It records over 17,000 species and has produced over 800 peer-reviewed papers using the TEPoP data. So although TEPoP data is of enormous value, we know citizen science data does have bias, even in structured schemes, which are designed to minimize this. In some cases, this bias is understood and can be accounted for in analyses, and many schemes have devised strategies to fill known gaps in coverage, such as holiday squares or upland rovers, and we have discussed these at previous TEPoP events, which you can see here on the right. In more recent TEPoP discussions, we have considered the gaps in coverage from an equity, diversity, and inclusion perspective, and how we can engage more volunteers not formally involved in recording, benefiting both the volunteer and the scheme from the potential of filling data gaps. So there's work on filling gaps within TEPoP schemes and across TEPoP schemes through the Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis Partnership. The work of the TSDA partnership looks to explore ways that TEPoP data can contribute to new requirements to evidence through new analyses or development of schemes in such a way that considers the interests and capabilities of the volunteers. So where possible, we look to undertake analyses or suggest scheme developments relevant across taxonomic groups to work across communities, both in taxonomic and organizational sense. So Michael will touch a little bit more on what TSDA is all about in his presentation a little bit later, but this is kind of just outlining what TSDA events we'll be talking about today. So these are the ones in orange. So yeah, you can see we have a lot to fit into today, so I'll try keep my introductions pretty brief. And without further ado, I will pass on to Michael Pocock from UKCH, who will tell you a little bit more about UKCH's TSDA related work. And whilst he is talking, please can you put your questions on the TSDA Jamboard, page 4 and 5, which Nikki will link in the chat, or has probably already done. I can't see. Yeah, so before I get there, this is the program for today, which you can just have a look at, and we will be running through a bunch of TSDA tasks, and then doing a filling geographic gap workshop, and then a couple more TSDA tasks, and then we will close at hopefully 11:45. So I will pass on to Michael Pocock.
Okay, thank you for your introduction, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to be talking about some of my work, or work that I've led, work that Diana has led, and work that Rob Boyd has led. So all of us are based at UKCH, but working under this TSDA, Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis. And it's brilliant to be able to speak with you today. So Nikki just introduced this project, or this partnership between CEH, BTO and JNCC. Overall, our vision is to support TEPoP schemes, to support you in providing evidence to get a more nature positive future. These are obviously great aspirations. There's a lot of stuff to be done on the ground in terms of doing that. There's a big role for data and environmental and biodiversity data within this. And so our role is to support and collaborate with the TEPoP schemes in making the best of the data that we've got. So adding value to the existing data, doing analysis, bringing analyses together, and developing that analytical and volunteer capacity. Broadly, we have structured this across 3 grand challenges. So adapting to new requirements for evidence, exploiting new data streams, and throughout all of our work being volunteer centred, or at least as having that as a principle which we always adopt. So this is a slightly more colourful but possibly confusing version of the slides that Nikki just showed, but it's to highlight some of the things that I will be focusing on. So specifically, I think it's worthwhile just having that step back, saying that we do know that recording by volunteers, even the structured recording schemes, has uneven coverage. That will be for a range of different reasons. With the structured schemes, it might be due to preferential uptake or dropout of squares which people have been allocated. And with the unstructured, there's clearly many drivers which will affect that uneven coverage, where people live, where people like to record, all the rest of it. All of this leads to the risk, the possibility of bias with the analyses for the questions that we are seeking to answer. So broadly, there are 2 ways of dealing with this. The second way is to deal with this after data collection. And that's what I'm going to be talking about secondly. So we can do smart ways of analysis, we can bring in covariates, all these sorts of things in order to take our existing data and deal with these risks, this potential for bias. The first approach, the one which I've listed second, is to actually influence the data collection. So how can we influence the way in which the data are collected? And this might be particularly pertinent for the unstructured recording. So that's what I'm going to talk about first. So that's this project, the Targeting Revisits Maps, which we've developed a couple of years ago now under TSDA. You might have heard me talk about it before. The idea about it, just to run through it quickly, is it's really simple. The task is, can you, once you've looked at the map, look at your locality and can you make the pink squares green? So pink squares are those which have been visited in only 1 year in the past, and green are those squares which have been visited in more than 1 year. The really simple reason for having such a clear distinction like this is that within the trend modelling that we do for occupancy analyses with this occurrence data, we will only use data from 1 kilometre squares, or currently, I should say, we only use data from 1 kilometre squares that have been visited in more than 1 year in the past. So what that means is if there is a square, a pink square on the map, which has been visited only in 1 year in the past, and I visit it again this year, then both of those data points, or both of those years, go into the analyses for the occupancy, for the occupancy analyses that we do. And that then contributes to data for trends for, I think it's in the region of 10,000 species, which goes towards state of nature reporting and things like that. What we wanted to do is explore this with a range of different invertebrate taxa, ranging from those which are reasonably well recorded, such as ladybirds and grasshoppers, to those which are much more sparsely recorded, such as creamflies and soldier flies, and so explore this space. And what we've done is we've gone back to those recorders or those users of the tool via a public call for information. And we've got this information. So what we found is that broadly, people said that yes, it's very likely or probable that a tool like the targeting revisits maps will influence their recording in the future. So it suggests that providing people with this information about the need for the data and also where they can go, where they can make a difference, is likely to influence them. How much will it influence them? Well, most people said some, which is not unexpected, but it's clearly more than a little. And so it suggests that, again, this provision of information can be influential in terms of people's recording behaviour. And how would it influence people? Well, as you can see here, people were really motivated to record in those targets for revisits, those pink squares. It didn't really have any effect on those squares which were green. If they wanted to visit those green squares, they still would. And with the unrecorded squares, surprisingly to us, this was actually something that people found really informative, because they were then motivated to go and fill the gaps, particularly, I think, in those more well-recorded regions of the UK. They were able to see where those gaps were. And you can see that quote there, being able to see how impactful my recording can be and directing me to where recording could have greatest impact, is immensely powerful and motivating. We asked a little bit more about people's motivations within this. And you can see that many people were saying that, yes, it did encourage behaviour change for them, in particular to go and visit or to consider visiting new sites. And we separated out that personal impact, someone reporting in the open question saying, I will make this change, versus the more generic one, where people said, well, someone could make a change in this way. But you can see that it was really impactful for site recording. There was some impact on taxa. And it was also really interesting to see these other ones, that people actually were, a large minority of people were saying that actually they felt reassured. It was brilliant to see that their data were useful. And also people found this a really valuable way to get information on their location, on the sites that are well visited, and the species that they were likely to see there. So being able to provide that information was valuable, and I suspect it linked through to the motivation as well, in terms of people visiting new sites and going and being more impactful in terms of their recording. We then ran some focus groups, and we've explored some of the feedback which came from that. Some people expressed a bit of concern about the way that this type of information could negatively influence data. It would manipulate the way that people were recording, manipulate the places that they were recording. So there were some concerns about that, but generally that wasn't major. People really liked the fact that it was simple and said, whatever you do in the future, keep it simple, make sure it has that simplicity of communication. But also, we were encouraged to explore ways of embedding it where best it fits within that recorder journey, and how this might be supported within existing recording tools. One of the big criticisms or ideas for future work was to find better ways of clarifying what a well-recorded square was. So we said there could be one record of one common species at any time, or sorry, in a couple of years, and then it would be deemed well recorded. And you can imagine that many recorders were saying, hang on, no, that doesn't mean it's well recorded. Can we think about species coverage? What percentage of the species that we think we're likely to see are being recorded there? What about the recency of records? Clearly, it feels valuable to go and re-record in a square which might have been well recorded, as we put it, a decade or so ago, but hasn't had recent records. That should also be targets for recording. So how do we bring all of this together, that species coverage and recency, while keeping it simple as well? That's something that we're going to be exploring over the coming year. So I said that the second aspect was going from affecting or influencing the way in which the data were collected to reduce that influence of bias and fill gaps and things like that. So this second aspect is about improving the data analysis. And in particular, Diana has led some work which has been looking at this idea of a missing data framework. I know that she's presented it in similar context to this in the past, so I'll try and run through this fairly quickly. But for those of you who are really keen, you can read the preprint of the paper at this EcoEvo archive, and I'll put the link for that in the chat after the talk. So missing data is not a problem that's unique to biodiversity sampling or anything like that. It's found throughout statistical sampling. And so the wonderful thing about using and accessing this idea of the missing data framework is that it opens up a whole realm of statistics that we can then draw upon, and we can draw upon the different approaches that have been used in order to try and develop solutions which are going to be really valuable for biodiversity monitoring. It also allows us to reflect on the current practice of different TEPoP schemes in terms of their use of missing data, and therefore allows us to get a better understanding within this missing data framework about how different people are doing things. So the one trouble, I should say, with the missing data framework is that the terminology I find horrendous, because you've basically got these three different types of missingness. Missing completely at random, missing at random, which in my mind actually is not at random, but nonetheless we'll go with their terminology, and missing not at random. So if you can get your head around those, then that sets you up really well for using the missing data framework. And clearly that translation to what it means for us in biodiversity monitoring is really valuable. So if the missing data is missing completely at random, it simply means that we're sampling in a way that's representative. We're sampling a random subset of the population, and that's all good. And actually, if that's truly the case, then we don't really need to worry about missing data. We simply say we've got a representative subset of the data of the population that we're interested in. Now, there might be certain cases in which we approach this, but by and large, I think this is really not very often likely to be the case. So instead, we've got this, to my mind, confusingly named missing at random, in which case the sample data is not representative, but we can take account of it with covariates, or we can have the situation where it's definitely missing not at random, and that would be the situation where the sample data is not representative because it's influenced by the thing that we care about. So people are more likely to record in places with rich biodiversity, nature reserves, places like that. That would be an example of missing not at random. And I'm sure you can imagine, therefore, there are loads of examples where we've got missing data which is missing not at random. In the paper, and you can read, as I say, in more detail about this, Diana has done some exploration about the missing at random and missing completely at random. And one of the key things that she's found through these simulations is that data gaps don't always matter. So understanding, and that means that we need to understand that relationship between environmental covariates and species abundance. Sorry, understanding that relationship is an example where data gaps don't always matter. You can see, rather than go through this in detail, I will point you to the paper. But it does mean that even when we do have missingness, we may be able to use data perfectly happily without leading to bias, either by understanding it's a representative random subset of the data, or we can take account of it with covariates. But data gaps can matter and can be really important. So you saw that previous example where the missing completely at random and missing at random didn't have an impact on the outputs. Well, when we look at trend modeling in this case, the type of missingness does have an impact on the trend modeling. And so you can see that there are steeper declines in the simulated data sets when you've got data that are missing at random than the missing completely at random, compared with the truth. And so clearly we do need to think about this. And as I say, the paper goes into a lot more detail about this, and actually explores some of the types of missingness, which can be taxonomic, can be temporal, and can be spatial. So all of these are important. So how do we deal with missing data? Well, if we take the information and the research that's been done under this missing data framework within statistical science, broadly, there are three main ways that are relevant to us in terms of coping with this. One is random subsampling. So you try and equalize across some sort of strata. Basically, what that means is that we throw away data. And I guess from the actually from some of the ethics, we don't really want to do that. The second is to up or downweight data. And so that's a reasonably standard method that we can do. If we can say that some sites or some strata or whatever are oversampled compared to others, then we can downweight them. And the final one is imputation, which is estimate missing data. And once again, within the paper, Diana explored some of these solutions and found that actually the amount of missing data is really important. In terms of these solutions. Generally, all of these types of solutions work well. So bias, which is, we want bias to be low, obviously. Bias is reduced as we apply these solutions, and bias is also reduced as the coverage increases greater and greater. As we're doing more fine scale modelling, or as we're seeking to model sparsely recorded taxa, that means that we head down towards the poorer coverage end of the graph. So bias is likely to be present, but we can begin to take account of it with these methods. The second thing is about the importance of our knowledge on the factors driving the sampling. So thinking about those covariates that we might use for our modelling. If we've got poor knowledge of those covariates, effectively we're using the wrong covariates in our models to try and take account of this, then we end up in a bad situation. When we're better informed about these covariates that are likely to be important in terms of bias, and can take account of them, then we end up in a much better situation. Just a couple of slides to reflect on some of the work that Rob Boyd, along with Ollie Pescott, have been doing at UKCH. This is not under TSDA, but under related work. They've been exploring this a little bit further, and they've actually been using some real-world examples. And what they did is that they were looking at the distribution of common heather, Calluna vulgaris, comparing the true distribution with sampled squares under atlas, atlasing type of approaches. And what they did was they were looking at the trends, and so the estimate is the distribution, the probability that heather is going to occur. And they tested methods that assumed that the data are missing at random, even though we know that the data are actually missing not at random. So they tested these methods assuming that they could account for bias perfectly while knowing that we couldn't. So you can see truth in terms of the distribution of heather and its decline is shown there in the black line. You can see that the unadjusted estimate is pretty poor, and that suggests that taking account of this is really important. And you can see that methods to do that accounted reasonably well. But when we go on to actually look at the trend, the truth shows about 5% decline in heather. The unadjusted, the naive estimate shows that it suggests that it hasn't really changed much at all. And all of these methods are reasonably good, but when we've got this situation where we're sampling the data, where the data are missing not at random, so sampling is affected by species presence, for instance, we're in the situation where we can reduce but not actually eliminate the bias simply through these statistical techniques. All of this is really informative in terms of helping us think about how we go forward with both the design of our sampling and taking account of it statistically. So we've got some upcoming work. One is about trialing some of these adjustments, particularly working with structured TEPoP schemes, so UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So Rob and Ollie are going to be exploring that and how useful those are. And I know that some of the schemes do use things like weighting already. And the second one is to be looking at how we can include some of these adjustments within unstructured data. And I'll talk about that a bit later. So final slide of conclusions is missing data can be problematic. It's not inevitably problematic, but it is problematic when the factors affecting sampling probability are the same as or correlated with those factors affecting species occurrence and abundance. When you've got sampling, the things that affect sampling are also the things that are driving those effects on species that we really care about. There are solutions available to reduce this bias, possibly not eliminate it, and most of them do increase the variance. So it might be that as we do this, our trends look more uncertain than they did previously, but that actually is a true reflection of true uncertainty that we have. The success of these solutions depends on a whole range of different factors which can be considered, can be taken into account. And I think Paul, in just a moment, is going to go on and talk about some of those sorts of things and about how we can effectively communicate some of these risks as well. So it does mean that we need better reporting of the amount of missing data that we have and how it's dealt with. These gaps, whether these gaps lead to bias, needs to be defined at a species data set level, not just at the whole data set. And so collecting data on these variables is important. And on that note, I will conclude.
Thanks so much, Michael. It was very, very interesting, and I look forward to seeing the follow-on work from this and attending the drop-in session on the 20th of November next week. So without further ado, I'll move on to Paul's presentation. Yeah, and just a reminder to post any questions in the Jamboard for Paul on page 6. Take it away, Paul.
Hi everyone, I'm Paul Woodcock at JNCC. I guess this bit of work has evolved a little bit. It started off thinking about biases, but then changed a bit to think more about how we communicate some of the strengths and the limitations within the data that's collected by TEPoP schemes. And this fits within this first challenge within the TSDA strategy about adapting to new requirements for evidence. And I've just pasted in the sort of bullet point ambition underneath that about being able to more consistently and effectively communicate strengths and limitations. And I think that's important for us, for our understanding, for our transparency. But we do also sometimes get questions from people wanting to use scheme data for different evidence requirements and asking things like, how do you keep schemes to a suitable standard? How do you ensure the quality of the data collected by volunteers? What's the accuracy of the scheme? What are the strengths? What are the uncertainties? Things like that. And I think all schemes do have a lot of really helpful information about this, but it's obviously presented at the moment in different places and to an extent in different ways as well. Initially, the objectives of this were to try and do scheme level information about communicating the biases for each scheme and how these are mitigated, and then also to do something that is more general, thinking about the strengths and the limitations across schemes and explaining that in a non-technical way to people who might not necessarily have a citizen science or a statistical background. So if you could just move on to the next one, Nikki, and probably click twice. Yeah, next one as well. So we started off with this question of how do we communicate the risk of bias, but having talked that through a little bit, we decided that the risk of bias really depends more on the questions that you're asking, so that the data sets can be suitable for one purpose, but not necessarily for others. But one of the things that does determine suitability is information about the coverage. So what species are covered by the scheme? What's the spatial, the geographic extent of the scheme? What range of environmental variables are covered, and how do those things change over time? So if you know the coverage, that can help to inform where and how you can use the data. So our question then became, how do you communicate scheme coverage in a way that can inform use? And we wanted to be fairly consistent in describing that across schemes as far as possible. So we've drafted out a template on this. And the idea is that this would have some standard text and then some text that would be populated by each scheme individually. Next one, Nikki. So we had, I think initially the content would have a sort of an overview of the scheme, and then each scheme would add information about the objectives, about the methods, and about the scope. And then we'd have information about the taxonomic and the geographic and the environmental coverage. Next one, Nikki. For the taxonomic coverage, what I was thinking is that we describe something like how many species are within the scope of the scheme potentially, how many does it actually produce trends for, and then how has that changed over time. And then we could also do something looking at whether the common or the rarer species are easier to produce trends for or not. So is there any skew in that respect? And then there would be a summary section explaining how any of the limitations in taxonomic coverage can be addressed. Next one, Nikki. And for the geographic coverage, I think this probably depends on the or describing this, I think, is considering the sampling effort and the sampling distribution and how those two things change over time. For sampling effort, hopefully it'd be possible for each scheme to add in information about the total number of sites for each country. And also it'd be good to include something about sample density at smaller spatial scales, because we sometimes get questions about that. And for sampling distribution, I think a map of coverage, and then maybe something more analytical, looking at whether sites are more clustered than you'd expect by chance. And I think for the geographic coverage, I think it will be important to make sure that we explain how schemes mitigate any limitations in that as well. Sorry, Nikki, yeah, next. And then for environmental coverage, this would be coverage of different habitats, coverage of different environmental variables. For the moment, I've mainly focused on the land cover habitat aspect of that. So I think something like number of sample sites within each land cover class, how does that compare with the total area for each land cover, and then we can say whether certain habitats or land covers are under or overrepresented. Yeah, next. And then I think at the end we'd have a few, if an opportunity for schemes to add anything else that they feel is an important consideration to take into account. Just a couple of other points. The idea is that these would go hopefully either on the scheme web pages or on JNCC website, whichever works better. And then when we can get some content agreed, it would be good to get that out there, but then also look to improve it and evolve it over time. Next. So that's the first part. Second part is this briefing note across schemes, and the idea is this would describe the strengths and the limitations of scheme data in a fairly non-technical way that's hopefully accessible. And one of the reasons for that is I think sometimes there are people who can be overly optimistic and positive about what we can use citizen science data for. Equally, there can sometimes be people who are more cynical, more skeptical about what you can really do with volunteer data. And then there are also probably people who just don't really know. And so what I hope this will do is at least give a bit of an introduction to different groups of people about what are the main strengths and what are the main limitations. Next. I've drafted something out on this already, which I'll circulate, but just briefly, the content I was thinking is something like explaining the approaches that we do that contribute to the reliability of the scheme. So thinking about the survey methods, the analytical methods, and then equally explaining what some of the important limitations and constraints are across TEPoP schemes. And I think one thing within this is it'd be really important to make sure that we explain or that we provide the evidence to back up the statements that we're making. So if we're saying the methods are good quality, how do we know this? If we're saying the data are good quality, what's the evidence that it's good quality? And we could include an appendix as well that has some of the resources that describe that. Next. So hopefully these sort of outputs will help inform the use of scheme data, and they might also help us to identify if there are things that we can address and tackle. In the short term, I think the main next steps are it'd be really good to discuss individually with each scheme how feasible it is to populate this template. Is it useful? Does it need adapting for individual schemes? And also to think about the briefing note and whether anybody's got any comments or suggestions and whether you'd be happy to have that as a jointly authored TEPoP publication. In the slightly longer term, I've just pasted in a bit more from that TSDA strategy. Essentially, I think if anybody's got any ideas about better ways of communicating information about schemes or about understanding or addressing limitations, it'd be really good to talk through those more. So yeah, please do get in touch. And then just last one, Nikki, thanks. So yeah, just to say thank you to a number of people who've been really helpful in shaping this work, and also I've lent quite a lot on several papers and reports and things that have been published. And yeah, so if you're interested in this and want to talk more about it, then please do get in touch. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was super interesting. Yeah, I will be moving on to the next presentation by Ailey. She will be outlining the TSDA work that was conducted in Northern Ireland, and then she will introduce the workshop discussion straight after that. So yeah, cue Ailey.
Thanks, Nikki. Yeah, hopefully you can hear me all right. So yeah, so we've been looking at, like Nikki just said, part of the TSDA, or the Terrestrial Surveillance Development Analysis work. We've been looking at geographical gaps, as it's been called, in Northern Ireland. But as we've gone through the process of looking into the gaps in Northern Ireland, we decided to call it an assessment of the barriers and challenges and solutions to improve in biological recording in Northern Ireland. So on my next slide, I'm going to go through, you on it, Nikki? Thank you. So the reason we looked at Northern Ireland was because of, well, partly because of this paper by Jenny in 2019, which showed that if you look on the second from the top row to the right, Northern Ireland is lacking in species trends for a lot of taxa. So you can see we've got a trend for about 40% of the species of birds. But in 2019, there was no butterflies, bats, or plants. And this is not quite correct anymore, because the last state of butterflies showed that they could get trends for about half of the butterfly species in Northern Ireland. And the map on the right is looking at the percentage of species of bats. And as you can see, the colours are quite a lot lighter in Northern Ireland, which means that there's less data. We can get less species trend in Northern Ireland than we can for the rest of the UK. Although the black squares do show gaps in a lot of Scotland, the places where you have got data in the atlas, it's quite sparse for Northern Ireland. So in the next slide, we were tasked with mapping the current biodiversity surveillance activities in Northern Ireland, summarising the evidence needs of stakeholders in Northern Ireland, and describing the barriers, opportunities to increase surveillance schemes, co-develop a series of recommendations, and review the approach used and lessons learned. So we're on the last point at the moment, having done all the first 4. So on the next slide, what I'll go through what we did is, so the first part was we interviewed scheme organisers, so that from across all taxa. So we interviewed people from National Plant Monitoring Team, Butterfly Conservation, BTO, Biological Records Centre, and stakeholders. And stakeholders such as DERA, so Northern Ireland's version of DEFRA, and CEDAR, so their local records centre. And so then from those interviews where we asked about the barriers and solutions and what they're doing in Northern Ireland, we compiled a report detailing the schemes that take place, the training, and organisations with a remit in Northern Ireland. But actually, we also noted some schemes that maybe don't have a remit in Northern Ireland but would like to, or what they're doing elsewhere, and the reasons why they possibly haven't been able to do some of the schemes or some of the recording in Northern Ireland. So then we did a taxa-based assessment of the data collected and recorded and available in Northern Ireland, and then looked at the barriers to biological recording from the interviews, and then the potential opportunities and solutions to the barriers. So some of these were from the interviews, and then we provided some recommendations based on the interviews, but also on some of our background. And then in the middle of October, we ran a workshop in Northern Ireland at Loughney Discovery Centre, where we got all of the people that we interviewed, and then other scheme organisers and stakeholders that we weren't able to interview into a room, and got them discussing the barriers and the solutions that we'd compiled for the report. It was a great day, and I think it went really well. And then now we're at the process of analysing and writing up the workshop findings. So on the next slide, I'm just going to show you some results. So we found this graph shows 10 barriers that we found in the interviews. I summarised it into these 10, and then we were able to summarise it into these 6 sections in the report. So things like capacity of organisations, data access issues, data flow, social and cultural issues, physical and land access, and taxonomic or technical expertise and requirements. And I'm going to go into them in a bit more detail. So on the next slide, it's the capacity of organisation. Next slide. I'm doing it too sneakily. Sorry, Nikki. Oh, we've missed one, I think. So the capacity of organisations is stuff like, there we go, staffing shortage, lack of engagement, no volunteer support network, limited funding. Then on the next slide, we look at data access issues, which covers just records just not getting submitted, confusion over multiple record systems, GDPR issues and verification issues, and missing data due to lack of capacity. Then the next slide shows that data flow should look like this. Ideally, is what we had an idea it should look like. So a recorder submits it to the National Biodiversity Data Centre in the Republic of Ireland, or CEDAR in Northern Ireland, or the scheme organisers such as Birdwatch Ireland or BTO, for instance, and then it goes into MBN. But actually, on the next slide, we show it's more messy. It's a bit more like this. So you've got data is often lost, either just not submitted or not verified, and then there's a delay often of getting it to MBN where is the open data repository. So the next slide shows that social and cultural issues are something like political, which could be with a capital P or a small p. So like, you know, actually not having the support from government, but also with politically in within schemes and between schemes and stakeholders. So like DERA and CEDAR and state scheme organisers not talking to each other. A general lack of interest in wildlife and recording. There's more of a focus on farming and pristine gardening in Northern Ireland, and a lack of governance from storming. And then the next slide looks at physical and land access. So this could be geographically, there's just less people in the west of Northern Ireland, so there's less people to record. Travel's often expensive, or they don't have an access to cars. Uninteresting places are also just difficult to get to or dangerous. There's no right to roam in Northern Ireland, so they also don't have public footpaths, which is a massive barrier to recording. And land ownership is politically and socially contested. And also the Troubles were mentioned a few times. So people just don't want to go to areas that they don't know for fear. And on the next slide, we look at, we break this down into taxonomic and technical expertise. So this could be just that some taxa are difficult to survey. So often the consensus is botany and invertebrates are just difficult to ID. I'm sure some people will disagree with me. And the species that are elusive are you're less likely to see. So often if you're doing birds or butterflies, you're more likely to go and see them when you go and record, whereas species like mammals, you get an idea that they've been there, so scats or burrows, and you can't actually see the animals or the organisms. And another main big barrier is that ARC the Amphibian Reptile Conservation don't have an organisational licence to survey reptiles in Northern Ireland. So they've got a licence in Scotland, Wales and England, but Northern Ireland, so that's another barrier to recording reptiles and amphibians. Then on my next slide, we just summarise the solutions. So quite briefly, the solutions on the right is from it's all from the interviews, and then we summarise it into these bits on the left. So increasing staffing, more funding, training, improving and gaining land access, increasing engagement, improving technical capacity, more support and a volunteer network, so where the volunteers coordinate other volunteers rather than it being staff, and better communication and collaboration. And obviously we go into detail on these a bit more in the report. Then on the next slide, this is some preliminary results. So it's kind of raw data. I've just graphed the raw data from the workshop. So we got individuals to rank the barriers that I've mentioned, just the six barriers, into what they think is most important. So 1 being the most important, so the top priority, and then 6 being the least. I think we might change how we present this in the report, but just to show you, so for most of you who were involved in this project, we can see there are preliminary results. And as you can see, most people thought that capacity of organisations was the most important, followed by taxonomic and technical expertise. There's a wide range of importance for social and cultural issues, which was quite interesting. And then physical land access, and then data access and flow was least important. So then on my next slide, I split these by government organisations and non-governmental organisations, and there's slight differences, which is quite interesting. So you can see on the left graph, government organisations found that capacity of organisations was most important, followed by expertise, taxonomic and technical expertise, whereas the non-government organisations also thought that capacity of organisations was important, but actually social and cultural issues were the most important. And then if we look on the next slide, once we talked about it in groups, so the colours on this graph is the different groups we had around the room. And it's ranked, so 1 is the most important and 6 is the least important. And again, there's slight differences from after they discussed their the barriers. The capacity of organisations is still the most important, but social and cultural issues creeped up a bit as more important. As I discussed it, that they found that without the data, then there's no data access issues. So it's it was quite interesting to hear these discussions. So I still need to analyse this further and write it up in the report. But I just wanted to show you what we found so far. And the next slide, Nikki. So we also at the workshop we then mapped the solutions to the barriers that I mentioned, the 6 barriers we mentioned before. So these posters were put up around the room. This is the absolute raw data. I haven't analysed this yet and gone into it. But just as a couple of examples, for capacity of organisations on the top left, one of the solutions, or a couple of people, a couple of groups, suggested that long-term targeted core funding for staff was a solution for capacity. And for social and cultural issues, engaging businesses, so it's councils mainly engaging businesses and schools, and also set up wildlife groups was another solution. So on the next slide. Thank you. So the next steps and the relevance for TEPoP, we've got to finish writing up the report, which includes recommendations for Northern Ireland. But hopefully we would like, so some of these barriers are not specific to Northern Ireland. Some of them are particularly to Northern Ireland, but some of them could be anywhere, and especially some of the schemes who have a remit over the UK also notice that these barriers aren't necessarily specific, only relevant for Northern Ireland. So we're hoping that further discussions will continue in Northern Ireland between DERA, NIA, CEDAR and the scheme organisers, so they can consider and implement our solutions and use our report to help. And then hopefully we're hoping that this can also be implemented elsewhere, so where the same barriers exist in other parts of the UK. So that's just a quick summary of our report and our findings so far. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to explain the breakout sessions, and we've got a couple of Slidos. So what we want you to do is the first Slido, which Nikki will do in a minute, is we want you to just have a wee think. Now I've kind of rattled through that quite quickly, of your main barriers for your scheme or your organisation, what you think the top, we can do 1 or 2 main barriers, and hopefully we'll capture any that we've missed, or anything that you think is particularly important. And then we're going to go into the breakout rooms, where we're going to discuss this question being, so if your organisation was given £2 million over 4 years, what would you do to increase coverage of recording? And then we're going to come back, and then we're going to just do another wee Slido, which will be, we want you to tell us our main solution. So it can be what you've discussed in the group, but it can also be any solutions you've just popped into your head or while you've gone through the discussion, but it's not on your the Jamboard for the question. We're hoping to capture that in the last Slido. So without further ado, hopefully Nikki can do the magic and create the Slido for me. Thank you very much. So if you scan this, or if you go on slido.com, you can and use this. There's a place to put in the code, and you should be able to type in the words for your main barriers that you found for your session. Hopefully you've all got that code, and you can all do the. Please let us know if there's any issues with the Slido. There's nothing seems to be coming in yet, so I'm just. Yeah, I should say it doesn't matter if you don't have a scheme. I've just noticed somebody's popped that in. It could be just your barrier to, using biological recording data. It doesn't also have to be in Northern Ireland. It could be anywhere across the UK. We just want to capture this. Can
you see the answers popping up, Ailey?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So like if you're a stakeholder or you use data, like what's the what do you think are the main barriers to collecting biological recording data, or using it, even if there's if there's a barrier to you being able to access the data. we thought that was quite important during the interviews, that data flow and data access was really important. But when we discussed it at the workshop, it wasn't as important, which was really interesting, actually. Because they kind of thought if they've not got the people to record the data, then they've not got any data to have issues with. So, but it did come up as a big issue, data access and flow. But I should say, like, sneaky sort of results of CEDAR and DERA are looking into CEDAR's capacity. So they've already done a review into CEDAR. So they are looking into the data access and flow issues. So that's really good so far. And DERA were chuffed that we were finding the same barriers as they were. So I don't know if we have anybody from DERA on the call, but or CEDAR. So cool. What we got now: organisation, capacity, skills, and experience, identifying and recording species. Yep, staff, taxonomic interest, skills and experience. Yep. Supporting brand new recorders, identifying target groups accurately. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, and retaining them, I think, was another. I don't want to give you barriers, but for us, retaining is often difficult. Or like they do engagement initiatives and then retaining them is another issue. Retaining volunteers. Lack of confidence of what to record. Yep, totally. Lack of knowledge of how to identify the species. Time taken to verify a sighting. Yep. No. We often, through the EDI work we've done through JNCC and TEPoP, we found that the demographic is often retired people because they have more time, which is a massive barrier. Difficulty assessing on land specified as desired location to survey by a structured recording team. Yep, no response from an owner. Yeah, Northern Ireland is even worse. So like they can't. Like I say, there's no public access. There's no public footpath, so they can't even go round the land. Often, a land ownership is a tricky one in Northern Ireland. I think Scotland's a wee bit easier with the right to roam, but I can imagine it's still an issue on private land. Finding volunteers up, yep. Either enough skills to participate or enough time to commitment, yep. Mismatch between where people want to visit and we would like them to visit. Okay, so we're probably going over time, are we, Nikki?
Yeah, that's perfect. I think
cool.
It's a nice summary between volunteers, data, species, and time at the top there.
Thank you. Feel free to write in the slide, or if anything pops into your head, and carry on while you're doing your discussion. But in the breakout rooms, we've got so Nikki will. Sorry, Nikki, I'll get to. We'll pop you into a breakout room in a minute. If you stay in the main group, you're probably with me, and we're going to be a breakout group in the main session. And then we've got a Jamboard each, which your facilitators will hopefully share with you when we break out, and you can pop your answers to the first question on there. So thanks, Nikki. Hopefully everybody's back or had a good conversations. I know we did. Keep writing on the Jamboard, and as Nikki just said that they're still going to be open, so keep popping your ideas on both of the pages, and hopefully you all got onto the section about if money was unlimited, if you didn't have the barrier of money, what are the barriers that still exist when you've got unlimited money.
Yeah, so I've popped in the slider again. It's another question, this time just focusing on solutions that your group may have thought of, or something that was relevant to your scheme or organisation. So yeah.
So it can be what you've just discussed, like Nikki said, or it can be something that you've maybe popped into your head while we're coming back, or you didn't have a chance to discuss. Anything, any sort of solutions you can think of to addressing the barriers of scheme coverage across the UK. Doesn't have to be in Northern Ireland, but if you do think of something in Northern Ireland that we can stick in the report, that would be even better. That's great. There's stuff coming in, so yeah. Awesome. I mean, yeah, more staff capacity. How do you think you would go about it, I suppose, is another thing. Hire more people for regional support. Yep, that's a great idea. Increase the number of experts verification, maybe through funded and more resources. Yeah, definitely. When I talk about capacity, I think, and the lack of resources, I think I mean, everything, staff, funding. And we're training at a local level, yet wider collaboration between organisations across the UK. Yeah, definitely, that's a big one. Communication and collaboration. And that was the main point of the workshop, was to get people chatting about, just talking in the same room, talking about it, and being able to meet each other, which is great. So there's still loads of stuff coming in, keep it coming, but I presume you wanting to move on, Nikki.
Yes, thank you. Right, thank you so much, Ailey, and all those involved in helping us co-design that workshop. I thought it was really, really well put together, and yeah, we'll be in touch with a kind of summary from that event shortly. And if anything else springs to mind, yeah, just pop it in the Slido or the Jamboard, and yeah, thanks so much. But moving along swiftly, Michael Pocock is back, and this time he's talking about missing data solutions. So over to you, Michael.
Don't worry, you didn't miss anything. I have already talked about missing data solutions.
Oh.
This is about the work going forward. Within this TSDA project, we are working, there's a few of us who are working on it and doing various different tasks within the project, but we don't want to do that in isolation. We want to do that with your support, with your guidance, with your input, and with your shaping. So this is just a very brief flyer, if you like, for 2 pieces of work that we're going to be doing, and then Nikki will talk about ways in which you can get involved. In particular, there's a meeting on coming up next week, I think it is, when you're going to be able to engage with us to express interest in being involved in a steering group or being asked to be kept involved. So, missing data solutions, I talked about the work that we've done so far. One of the key things that we would like to do is apply these sorts of solutions to the unstructured data, so the sorts of biological record centre type of data sets, and developing the existing analyses we've got, testing the impact of those solutions with simulations, and in particular, I think this is going to be valuable, predicting or being able to assess then what types of species or species with what types of distributions are most likely to be impacted by these biases. So have you got thoughts about particular data that you think are available or should be used for weighting that currently we're not using for weighting? I think we could potentially have more informed weighting variables there. And secondly, just thinking through some of those impacts on how we develop and improve this in terms of that unstructured recording. Are you aware of risks? Would you like to be kept informed about how that shapes up? So that's the first one. And then on to the next one. Another piece of work which we've got going on or which we've got planned under TSDA this coming year is about adding value to unstructured data. Rich Broughton and I did a report a couple of years ago which was looking at that, but we're aware that many people are actually collecting data in a reasonably semi-structured way, but then we throw them into the big data set of unstructured data and then we treat them as if they're unstructured. So are there simple ways in which we can explore bringing back or sort of being able to acknowledge and use that degree of structure within those data? So on to the next slide. So what we want to do is work with an exemplar recording scheme. We're hoping to engage with the Dragonfly recording scheme as a first port of call, understanding how people do their recording, how much data are collected in a semi-structured way, even though they go into this big unstructured or less structured sort of final data set. Can we look back in time and identify those records which are collected in a more structured way and use that additional data or metadata for analyses? And can we explore how tools such as iRecord can help us capture those data metadata? How do we work with volunteers to understand what's acceptable to them? And then the next slide. So why might you be interested in coming along in a week's time talking with us about being involved in this sort of thing? Well, we want to, I think the benefits to you would be the potential to efficiently add value to the volunteer recording, which I think can motivate recorders. It adds value to this without the cost of setting up a brand new structured scheme for this, that, the other, but allows us to get the benefits of both. Actually, there's the potential to link up across with consistent approaches which are happening elsewhere in Europe and potentially the world as well. So if you're interested in exploring these sorts of things, if you've got if that's sparked off some ideas, or you're going, actually, I really care about this stuff, I want to talk with you, come along and join the session. Back to Nikki.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to pass on.
Morning, everyone. Yes, it is still morning. So just very quickly, I'm going to outline what's going to be hopefully an emerging kind of piece of work for us under the TSDA partnership that we're just going to be spending a very little bit of time on this year to hopefully better inform what we might do in future years. Next slide, please. So the issue of our rivers and the quality of those rivers has been very much in the news this year and previously. Obviously, the state of our rivers and the kind of pollution in them hit the headlines this summer. Next slide. And even flagged concerns about safety for wild swimming. This is in rivers. This is from the National Geographic. Who knew that the UK was a travel destination for people undertaking wild swimming? Or maybe it isn't anymore. Next slide, please. And also there are issues with the management of our freshwaters and rivers that's particularly come to light in recent weeks around concerns over flooding, but also in the context of climate change, not just flooding, but also issues of drought and water availability as well. So there's lots of issues in relation to management of rivers and freshwaters in this country. Next slide, please. And we've got potential with our surveillance schemes supported by TEPoP and others involved in data collection to look at biological responses to these kind of pressures and policy interventions as well. So this is something from the latest State of Nature report, analyses, I think, of biological records data demonstrating real increases in the occurrence of freshwater invertebrates since the 1990s. And I think this is particularly attributable to some of the changes in water quality that were associated or that have occurred over that time frame. Next slide, please. And we've just published DEFRA's just published the latest kind of wild bird indicators, and this is a graph from that demonstrating different sort of patterns of trends for different wetland bird species. So the black line that's kind of somewhat hidden in the middle is a slightly declining line over time, but there's heterogeneity in that. So species associated with kind of wet grassland habitats have declined the most. Some of the riparian species are also showing evidence of decline, particularly if you look at the top blue graph. Interestingly, kind of increases in the birds associated with slow flowing rivers that have now been reversed over the last sort of 15-20 years or so. And lots of there's a need to do more work to understand some of the drivers behind some of these changes. Next slide, please. So what we're aiming to achieve through this piece of work is recognizing that our fresh waters are subject to a wide range of different drivers, as I've said, and there is increasing kind of policy interest in them as well around issues of water quality and so on. So it struck us as a kind of under the TSDAs, there's an opportunity to pull together different elements of that biological surveillance data, which are showing different patterns to with other potential data sets as well, recognizing that other organizations are monitoring, whether Environment Agency or others involving biodiversity monitoring in fresh waters as well, things like the Riverflies Partnership, for example, to try and see what that is telling us about change in the freshwater environment. Next slide, please. So what we'll be doing, as I said, this is really a very small piece of work for this summer, spring and summer, to really scope out what we might do in more detail next year and beyond. So looking at the potential data that might be available across our TEPoP schemes, reaching out to other potential data holders outside of our kind of partnership, and organising a short workshop with potential stakeholders to look at some of the opportunities of pulling together those data to answer key questions and what those key questions might be. And as I said, wanting to do that to then inform what will be a more significant programme of work, probably to start from October 24 onwards. Next slide, please. So hopefully this will be of interest to many of you. Obviously, there's a collective need to understand how environmental change is driving biological responses in freshwater habitats. We want to be supportive in terms of understanding what that looks like in terms of the uses and reporting of data across our schemes, and obviously wanting to be integrated with other initiatives as well, things like the CUSCO initiative led by the Rivers Trust and United Utilities that I know a number of you will be involved with. So there'll be lots of opportunities to get involved and to shape this area of work. So if this is an area of interest, do come along and talk to me more about this at the session next week, which will be just after lunch. Thanks very much.
Thank you, James. That was great. I'll pass over swiftly to Alan, who will have 5 minutes to just talk about his and Ellie's work package. Take it away, Alan.
Yep, so I'm just going to speak briefly on a piece of work that we're going to be doing at JNCC this coming TSDA year, looking at multi-taxon analysis. So just by way of a bit of background, obviously there's increasingly a call for not just the national kind of biodiversity trends that we're used to working with, but also the regional and landscape and local scale trends. And the data that is required to produce these. But the kind of the national scale scheme data, there are certain questions that it's difficult to answer at local levels with that. So questions on, for example, species interactions, you're limited by the number of squares you have that are visited by multiple schemes. So your data isn't co-located, you can't as easily think about things like species interactions. And you're also limited by the density of samples at a local level to kind of draw landscape and local scale conclusions. So to kind of try and tackle this, there's a number of projects that are springing up. Tracking the Impact is one, which is based in the Chilterns AONB, which is looking to basically take scheme protocols, localize them, and at a landscape scale, start gathering information that can then be used to answer landscape scale questions. And this project is basically going to be starting to look at the type of data that's coming out of these localized scheme protocol projects and see what sort of questions we can ask with it, what questions can we maybe not ask with it, and also understand how this data might feed into the kind of work we do at kind of regional and national levels, and the effect that it might have, say, on the national scale trends that we're producing. So apologies. So yeah, this piece of work fits into the multi-taxon ecosystem indicators and ecosystem health work package. And basically what we're aiming to do is experiment a bit with the sort of data that's coming out of these types of localized projects to understand, yeah, as I say, what can't be done, what sorts of analyses we can do. From this, we can start to say, what can we say about landscape biodiversity distributions? What can we do in terms of kind of cross-taxa analyses, multi-species indicators? How could this potentially inform different efforts by SNCBs and other stakeholders looking at things like ecosystem health metrics, ecosystem resilience metrics, and to try and identify what the added value is of these kind of localized schemes where you have these higher densities of sample sites, but also where those sample sites are co-located and you have multiple schemes surveying the same place, and try and, you know, demonstrate the added value that you get from that sort of approach. So in terms of a plan, we're going to be doing some initial analyses of the data to see how how it looks, how we get the data from the different schemes to work together in single analyses. We're going to do a very high-level literature review to think about multi-taxon indicators that we can potentially apply to this sort of data. We're going to be engaging with partner organizations, SNCBs, people who are interested in these kind of multi-taxon indicators of ecosystem health and resilience. And then based on all of that, we're going to be basically just experimenting and testing this data with a bunch of different approaches that we're going to identify through those first 3 points, see what we can do, what we can't do, possibly supplementing with simulated data as well, depending on what's required. So why might this be of interest? Well, we're thinking about the added value of this data being localized and co-located, thinking about what this can offer to partners, to the national biodiversity metrics. Obviously, this is very exploratory and scoping, so there's a lot of room for suggestions, expertise, if people want to get involved. We'll have a slot at the drop-in session next week. Obviously, supporting potentially this development of multi-species indicators and ecosystem metrics, which I imagine a lot of people on the call are quite interested in. And we're also going to be kind of thinking a bit about how the scheme data can complement each other in single analyses, and whether looking at multiple taxa can tell you something more about the dynamics of the ecosystem than maybe looking at the taxa in isolation can. So as I say, we have a slot on the 20th, 12:25. So if you're interested in hearing more, discussing, inputting ideas, then yeah, please come along.
Thanks, Alan. I'll just pass over to Nikki, who will close the session. But yeah, thanks to everyone for sticking to time and dealing with the various technical hiccups. Nikki.
Hi, everyone.
You've got it, yeah.
I just wanted to close up, well, firstly by saying thank you to everyone today. We've packed a lot in, which I think is quite reflective of how much is going on in TSDA, which is always really exciting. But I just wanted to highlight that sort of everyone on this call, you are kind of key TSDA stakeholders, and it is really great to have representation from you in these TSDA analysis tasks and steering them. So we would really like to see lots of you at the drop-in sessions for further discussions if you're interested, if they're relevant to any projects that you're working on, or if there are colleagues that you work with that you know might also be interested in anything you've heard about today or through any of the TEPoP events, then please do share the joining details for the event next week. And we look forward to having lots of discussions with you there. And just to say thank you to everybody that's contributed to the task groups over the course of this year. And you've helped to shape a lot of the work that you've heard about over the last few sessions. So thanks very much. Hopefully we'll see lots of you next week, and then the final UKOF Citizen Science Symposium in a couple of weeks' time. So thanks very much. Thanks for coming today.